For centuries, the open seas were a place of trade, warfare, and exploration, but for some, they were a floating prison. Few fates were as brutal as that of the galley slave. Shackled to their oars, whipped into exhaustion, and forced to row until their bodies gave out, these men lived and died in a never-ending cycle of suffering. Today, we're diving into the grueling, nightmarish reality of life as a galley slave. The practice of using human power to propel ships dates back to ancient civilizations, with the earliest records indicating that free citizens primarily manned the oars. In ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, rowing was considered a skilled profession, and those who took on this role were often compensated for their labor. Slaves were occasionally employed during times of manpower shortages, but this was not the standard practice. As maritime warfare evolved, especially during the medieval and Renaissance periods, the demand for rowers increased significantly. Mediterranean powers such as Venice, Spain, and the Ottoman Empire expanded their naval fleets, leading to a higher demand for manpower. This surge in naval activity coincided with a shift towards the use of forced labor. Convicts, prisoners of war, and enslaved individuals were increasingly utilized to meet the growing need for rowers. Galley slaves came from diverse and often tragic backgrounds. Many were prisoners of war, captured during the numerous conflicts between Christian and Muslim states, and subsequently forced into servitude as rowers. Convicted criminals also found themselves sentenced to the galleys for offenses ranging from theft to rebellion. Political and religious dissenters, including heretics and other perceived enemies of the state, were condemned to this harsh existence as a means of punishment and control. Additionally, pirates and enemy forces frequently kidnapped impoverished civilians from coastal regions, selling them into slavery to serve on galleys. Some destitute individuals, driven by desperation, voluntarily joined the galleys in exchange for basic sustenance, unaware of the brutal conditions they would face. This mixture of backgrounds resulted in crews composed of various nationalities, religions, and languages, leading to communication challenges and internal conflicts among the enslaved rowers. Life aboard a galley was a relentless ordeal marked by grueling labor, harsh discipline, and deplorable living conditions. Galley slaves were shackled to their rowing benches, confining them to a narrow space where they spent almost the entirety of their existence. These benches served as their dining area, sleeping quarters, and even the place for bodily functions, as movement was severely restricted. The chains ensured that slaves remained in position, preventing any chance of escape or significant movement. Rowing sessions were exhaustive, often lasting between 10 to 12 hours with minimal rest. During naval engagements or emergencies, slaves could be forced to row continuously through the night, pushing human endurance to its limits. The physical demands were immense, requiring synchronized effort to maneuver the massive oars that powered the vessel. Discipline on galleys was maintained through fear and brutal punishment. Overseers wielded whips, clubs, and heated irons to enforce obedience and maximize output. Any sign of fatigue, dissent, or failure to maintain the rowing rhythm could result in immediate and severe corporal punishment, serving as a grim reminder to others of the consequences of defiance. The confined quarters of the galley were plagued by unsanitary conditions, with slaves eating, sleeping, and relieving themselves in the same cramped space. The stench of sweat, excrement, and unwashed bodies was overpowering. Such an environment was a breeding ground for disease. exacerbated by the lack of proper hygiene facilities. Often exposed to the elements, galley slaves endured the full brunt of nature's extremes. Under the scorching sun, they faced dehydration and heat exhaustion, while cold nights brought chills and the risk of hypothermia. Violent storms added another layer of peril, with slaves remaining chained to their benches, unable to seek shelter or safety. In the event of capsize, this often resulted in galley slaves going down with their ship. The daily existence of galley slaves was marked by severe deprivation and neglect, particularly concerning their nutrition and health. Galley slaves subsisted on a meager and nutritionally deficient diet. Their daily fare typically included stale bread, thin gruel, or a basic stew, which often lacked essential nutrients. The quality of food was poor, with provisions sometimes spoiled or infested with vermin, further diminishing their nutritional value. This inadequate diet failed to meet the caloric demands of the grueling physical labor required of the rowers. Access to fresh water was also severely limited aboard galleys. Water rations were strictly controlled, and slaves often received insufficient quantities to stay hydrated, especially under the relentless heat of the sun. Dehydration was a common affliction, exacerbating the physical strain and leading to a host of health issues. The combination of poor diet and unsanitary living conditions created a breeding ground for diseases. Malnutrition weakened the immune systems of the slaves, making them susceptible to ailments such as scurvy, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, and dysentery, resulting from contaminated food and water. Infections were rampant, and the close quarters facilitated the rapid spread of illnesses. The lack of fresh produce and balanced nutrition led to chronic health problems, further diminishing the slaves' ability to endure the harsh conditions. Medical care for galley slaves was also virtually non-existent. Injuries sustained from the strenuous rowing, frequent beatings, and accidents were rarely treated adequately. Open wounds often became infected, and without proper medical intervention, many injuries proved fatal. Diseases went largely untreated, and afflicted individuals were typically left to suffer without relief. The mortality rate was high, with many slaves dying at their benches still shackled in place. Their bodies were often disposed of unceremoniously, reflecting the disregard for their lives and well-being. The psychological torment endured by galley slaves was profound, stemming from the harsh realities of their existence. For many galley slaves, the prospect of regaining freedom was bleak. Sentences were often for life, and the grueling conditions made survival itself uncertain. This pervasive sense of hopelessness eroded their will, as the endless days of toil offered little respite or possibility of release. Faced with unbearable suffering, some slaves saw death as the only escape. Instances of individuals throwing themselves overboard were not uncommon, choosing the uncertainty of the sea over the certainty of continued torment. Others attempted rebellion or escape, despite the overwhelming odds and the severe repercussions if recaptured. These acts, though often futile, underscored the depth of their desperation and desire for autonomy. The psychological and physical hardships of galley slavery created an environment where despair was pervasive, and mortality was a constant companion. If you found this exploration into the lives of galley slaves interesting, be sure to check out our video about sailor punishments in the Age of Sail on your screen now. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps us out. Thank you for watching, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next one.